Amen. So we live in a world of violence. I think our world has always been violent. We turn on the news and we can see accounts of it. We open our Facebook or social media feeds and we can see accounts of it. We don't seem to feel safe anywhere. In our schools, in our churches, in our shopping centers, in our concert halls, walking down the streets in our communities. Violence just seems to be all around us. We can't seem to escape it. And on this Good Friday, we come and we're reminded again that even in the midst of our religion, it's rooted and based in a sense of violence. We started our Lenten season with Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday, we took the palms from the previous Palm Sunday, and we burned them and take them and place them on our foreheads, and the thing is said to us, "From dust you came, and to dust you shall return." We're reminded then of our mortality. And this last Ash Wednesday, though, was unique for us, because the Ash Wednesday of our Lenten season this time, we were reminded in a fresh way of our mortality when 17 lives at Stoneless Douglas High School were taken. And there's this image that I remember seeing on the news that day of this mother outside of the school, overwhelmed with grief of not knowing the status of her child still in the school. And then the mark on her forehead that just a few hours before she had been in a church, and as someone put a cross on her forehead, they uttered the words to her, "From ashes you came, and to ashes you shall return." Reminded of her mortality earlier, and in this moment reminded of her child's mortality. Reminded of the violent world we live in. You know, we live in this violent world, and oftentimes we're not always sure how to respond to the violence. Whether that's how to grieve it, or accept it, or understand it, how to respond and to stop it. We wrestle with that as we have through all of history. Violence. And where do we get our cue? Where do we get our direction as Christians of how to respond to violence? I think there's no better place than for us to turn to the cross tonight. There's no better place for us to turn to Jesus, who bore himself and in his body the anger and the brokenness and the violence of humanity in himself when he didn't deserve it. And to look at Jesus and to remember that none of us deserve any form of violence. We are his creation. We are created in Christ's image. We saw in this drama tonight a few things play out. First, we see the scene of Pilate taking this sign and putting it above the cross that says, "King of the Jews." Now, the religious leaders that were there to witness the death of Jesus and who had really proclaimed for his death, "Crucify, crucify," were standing and watching, and they said, "Don't put that there, that's not right. Put a man who said he was the King of the Jews." But Pilate said, "I said what I said, it's going up." And the religious elite, who you would think would be people who would want to seek peace and justice and reconciliation and healing for the world, were the religious ones, were the very ones saying, "Crucify." Were the very ones who could stand by and watch this man flogged and nails placed into his body and hung on a cross, and they stood there and watched him till he took his last breath, this overwhelming act of violence. And they seemed to be just sort of immune to it. I think many in our society are immune to the violence. It's normative. It's justice. At the foot of the cross are a few soldiers. And if you couldn't strip Jesus any more of his humanity, Jesus didn't have a house. He didn't even have a pillow to lay his head on. Jesus had his cloak, and they stripped him of it, and he hung naked on a cross. And you know what they did with that cloak? They didn't take it and hand it to his mother, who was standing nearby. They said, let's just raffle it off for who gets this cloak. This man is dying in this awful, awful form of violence, and these guards at the foot of the cross, it's no big deal. And then standing there is Mary, Jesus' mother, and Mary's sister, also named Mary, and Mary Magdalene. They really liked Mary's name back then, I guess. Or Jesus was really fond of people named Mary. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved is standing there with them. And Jesus calls them forward to the base of the cross, and in this final moments, I mean, he didn't say very many things. He didn't have, I'm sure, so many things rushed across his brain, but as he's dying on the cross, guess who Jesus is thinking about? His mother. And his disciple whom he loved, and he says, take care of my mom. Take care of my mom. He's dying on a cross, and he's thinking about his mom. Jesus said many things that day as he hung on that cross. He said many things that day as he hung on that cross. But the most beautiful thing I think that Jesus said that day was, Father, Abba, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In the midst of overwhelming violence, he says they don't get it. They don't understand. The very people who I formed by dust and breathed my spirit into are the very ones who are going to take my life. But forgive them, God, they don't know. You know, he could have stood up on the cross and he could have said, enough, Mom, go get the disciples and the rest of the followers. We're having an uprising. We're having a rebellion. He could have tapped into his divinity and said, I'm coming down off of this cross right now, and I'm going to make heads spin and turn, and I'm going to get my vengeance. You know that the way that we think about God is often the way that we treat other people. If you think about God as this angry, vengeful, wrathful person who just sort of is like Santa and keeping track of the good and the naughty and the bad and the nice, and he knows when you're sleeping and he knows when you're awake, there's a good chance to probably treat other people in your life like that too. And I think many times it's exactly why the religious elite and the guards didn't recognize God in Jesus, because their God was very wrathful in their minds. He was very angry. He needed a price and a penance to be paid. He needed an offering to be sacrificed. Sure, the Jewish folk at the time, they had a sacrificial system, but so did the Romans. They just sacrificed to multiple gods. They believed that they needed the sacrifice so that the gods would look upon them favorably and send rain on their land and prosper their fields and heal their children and provide for them and bless them in battle and in war. They believed that they needed to offer the gods a sacrifice. They never pictured a God sacrificing himself or herself for them. Never pictured it. And so they look at Jesus, this forgiving, patient, kind man who calls people to turn the other cheek and to love your enemy and to not fight evil with evil. And this God who called them to a different way. And they go, that's just not the God that I know of. And so they couldn't see God in Christ. I find myself wrestling with the story. You know, after Jesus passed away and resurrected, and we'll come to all that later, his disciples and his followers for the next couple hundred years really had to wrestle with, when we're persecuted, what do? Do we rise up and do we fight back? Or do we lay down our lives like Christ laid down his? Do we fight violence for violence and evil for evil? Do we turn the other cheek, and do we love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us? Or do we just say, Jesus just didn't probably get it right? Or if he had known what we were going to suffer, then he surely would have not told us to do those things, right? No, the church wrestled with that as we wrestle today. How do we respond to violence in a violent world? You know, Dr. Martin Luther King was known for a quote during his movements, his call to nonviolence and resistance to injustice and violence against black and brown communities in the world. He says this, he said, "Hate begets hate, and violence begets violence. Toughness begets a greater toughness. And returning violence for violence only multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars." Jesus knew that. And Jesus calls us, in a world full of violence, to not deal with the world as the world has dealt with it from the beginning. We live in a world that our history has been written by civil wars to world wars. But we also live in a world that's been written in blood. Blood that did not fight back, but blood that said that love and fear would not be compatible, but that love would overcome fear, and love would overcome hate, and love would overcome violence. Many of you, as we end this message, may have heard the 1 Corinthians chapter 13, perhaps read at your own wedding, or read in church at some point, as the definition of what love is. I think it's most often read at weddings because the hardest people to love is your spouse. You live in close community and life with them, and it really teaches you to have to learn to turn the other cheek. It really has to teach you how to love and to not serve evil up for evil, but to be forgiving and patient with one another. And in the midst of that passage, I want us to think about how Jesus emulated love in his life. So I'm going to ask you and call you in this time as we end this message to enter into a time of reflection by maybe just closing your eyes to remove any distractions, and perhaps just place your hands in an open palm posture. If you were in danger and you felt your life was at risk, oftentimes what people do is they throw their hands up with palms open, "I surrender." And so in this moment in a violent world, I'm going to challenge you to surrender right now. And open your arms and hands and your heart and hear this verse in the context of Jesus. And so I pray that we may look to the cross of Jesus this Good Friday and see the goodness of God, who amidst the violence chose not to force himself on others, chose not to stop loving. He chose to care for others more than for himself. Christ chose not to put himself first. He chose not to fly off the handle. He chose not to keep score of the sins of others. He chose not to revel when others groveled. As Christ chose to take pleasure in the flowering of truth, he chose to put up with anything, chose to trust God always. He chose to always look for the best. Jesus, he never looked back, but he kept going. He kept going to the end.